You're listening to The Culture Report, Radio VR's weekly look into the world of arts, culture, and history. I'm Rob Sachs. From time to time on The Culture Report, we like to check in with William Brumfield. He's a professor of Russian studies at Tulane University. He's also a world-renowned expert on Russian architecture and an explorer of the Russian countryside. Today we're going to talk about the Stroganovs and Ustiuzhna.
Correct.
Yes, it's a tough name, but we're so glad you're here to tell us about what took you to Ustiuzhna and to learn about the Stroganovs, who I'm assuming are not the kings of noodles.
Well, actually, they are.
They are the kings of noodles.
Yeah. They got their start in the far Russian north and got into the salt business. There are a lot of salt brine lakes in the Russian north. Salt was an extremely valuable commodity in the medieval period. It is today, for that matter, but particularly in those days before refrigeration, salt was essential, not only because the body needs it, but also to preserve certain foodstuffs. So that if you knew how to produce salt and you knew how to sell it, then you could become a very wealthy person indeed. And there were some merchants, Stroganovs among them, who succeeded at that on a fantastic level in the 16th century, to such a degree that they actually were, shall we say, on working terms with the dreaded Tsar Ivan the Terrible himself. So this was very, very important business, the ability to refine salt. And the north is where that action took place, and the rivers of the north enabled them to transport salt to the market, which means the central Russia and the area around Moscow. So that's where the Stroganovs got their start. Later, they were given nobility status, and Peter the Great encouraged them to move to St. Petersburg, as he did many other prominent and wealthy people. And at that point, they eventually moved into the grand palaces and had all of the French chefs. And so beef stroganoff is a product of that, and the rest is, well, I wouldn't say it's high cuisine, but it's
who doesn't like
still
beef
carries
stroganoff?
its weight, yeah.
So, okay, so it is related to these Stroganovs, who are the kings of salt, I guess, and then that turned into them just being the kings of everything, and then they get a dish named after them, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, there's some French chef. I'm not really sure what the history was, but it's a very rich dish, and people, particularly students, have had to suffer through it in many different forms in the university dormitories. But yeah, it's all related to that family, which played an enormous part in Russian economy and Russian culture.
Now, you're looking into where the family was before they moved to St. Petersburg.
That's right.
And tell us about this area of Russia. What took you there initially? What were your thoughts about why you wanted to visit?
I had known it was an important place for Russian culture, particularly in the medieval period, that it had great church art. For a while, it was off limits to foreigners. But that began to change in the late 1980s, and particularly in the 1990s. So that once I had explored the terrain through acquaintances with scholars in Moscow and scholarly literature, then I was prepared to move up first to Volgoda and then on up to the Arkhangelsk territory. The Stroganovs were active in a number of places, including the Ural Mountains. So the rivers allowed them to put their entrepreneurial gifts to use over a great part of the Russian northern terrain. Ustiuzhna, or Ustiuzhna, as some people pronounce it, is just one of the westernmost places in that medieval period. They had trading operations in that town, and wherever the Stroganovs were, they left a mark on the church art. They were just very gifted patrons of church building and church decoration. It's a remarkable story.
And so you head to Ustiuzhna, and you come upon some remarkable art in these churches. Can you tell us about some of the scenes you saw?
When you go into these churches, and most of the Stroganov churches were eventually painted, they might have been built by one member of the Stroganov family, and then another one would come on a generation later and pay for the painting. There are various stages at which this was done in the various locations where they were active, but when you go into these churches, you're confronted with this polychrome interior that's difficult to put in words. The entire surface is painted. These paintings are in registers or rows extending to the top. And they deal with biblical scenes, scenes from the lives of saints. The church in Ustiuzhna was actually painted by master artist from Yaroslavl on the Volga River. It's long been known as a center for Russian painting, certainly in the 17th century, but the 18th century they were also very gifted. People simply know less about it, and they combine Western elements from Western engraved Bibles, for example, with Russian interpretations of biblical scenes. And I think it's that mixture of their Russian remote perception of Western art and their own traditions of color and form that's so fascinating. Because on one hand, it's very, very naive. You see that particularly in the wonderful frescoes that I had in my the article that you referred to. You see that in the depictions of Adam and Eve. This is definitely not your Renaissance. But on the other hand, it's lovely. And to see the way they interpret these legends as such a part of our Western civilization is quite intriguing.
So this happened, these are 17th and 18th century frescoes and other paintings you're looking at. Of course, you weren't seeing a lot of ecclesiastical artwork being done in the 20th century with the communist state really trying to tamp down on church in general. Has there been a revival then of interest in this kind of artwork since the fall of communism?
It's been something of a contradictory story because Lenin very early obviously was a foe of the church, any form of organized religion. He saw as a break on the country's development. It was something that had to be overcome if Russia was going to move forward, or the Soviet Union, it was known from the 1920s. But on the other hand, Lenin, as an intellectual, understood that Russia had art, that it had art history, and he gathered people who were specialists and experts who gave their opinion. This should be saved, this should not. I don't want to convey a sort of rosy view of what happened. The Soviet period was enormously destructive of church art. The church itself sometimes had the difficulty distinguishing art from liturgical purposes. After all, for the church, an icon is primarily a form of veneration, of devotion. So art historians who were secular people and the church had divergent views of this, quite apart from the political changes. So you had some church art very carefully restored during the Soviet period, preserved and restored. And you had other examples that were simply destroyed. So that it's a very contradictory situation. But what the Stroganovs did was rather high on the secular appraisal. That this is part of our history, so we need to preserve this, quite apart from what the church wanted. Now, the church has since come back into some of these spaces, and that's true of the Church of the Kazan icon of the Virgin that I write about in the article. It's now an active church, a very active parish church. But the art was preserved at a time when there were no services there. It was preserved as a cultural landmark. So you have to distinguish not just between the change in the political situation, but also the way these works of art were viewed, on the one hand, by the church, and on the other hand, by art historians.
I have to imagine the clout of the Stroganovs and their wealth also factored into people thinking that these are
That's right.
Art forms that need to be preserved.
Absolutely, yep, because of the role that they played in Russian history. And even there, at various points during the Soviet period, that might have been condemned as a part of noble imperial excess, but you couldn't easily dismiss it. So I would agree with you that this certainly provided an additional argument for preserving this art, that it's a part of the grand design in the development of Russia. You can't exclude the Stroganovs from that picture.
Professor Brumfield, you mentioned that these areas were only recently open to Western tourists. Why were they off limits, and what was it like being someone from the West going into these regions? I imagine there's not a lot of other tourists, coming from New Orleans, checking out their churches.
Well, it's not just a matter of New Orleans. It's a matter from the West generally. There were very few tourists in these parts of the North, and that's true to this day. In many areas, the lack of infrastructure. There are other places, such as Volgoda, though, that are putting a very strong emphasis on the development of tourism, both Russian and foreign. It's not something you can do overnight, but my sense of discovery was not of some sort of remote, hidden Shangri-La. There were already a number of contacts with the West by the time I got there in the mid-1990s. But the sense of discovery was still there, and I think that's true in certain other parts of the Russian North, about which I've also written, and where the Stroganovs also sponsored enormously appealing church art. This is a rich topic that needs to be further explored. Soviet art historians did their part, particularly after the Second World War, but there's much still to be written and explored in this area. There's some really very surprising discoveries, the high level of art and craftsmanship in these northern churches, some of which were built by the Stroganovs and others by other merchants in that region. So there's a lot still to be explored there.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us this piece of Russian history. We so much enjoy learning about your travels and hearing about these places that so often we don't hear about unless you introduce us to them.
Well, I'm happy to do that. It's a very pleasant duty on my part. It's certainly worth the exploration, and I hope that many more people will follow this path of discovery.
That's William Brumfield. He's a professor of Russian studies at Tulane University. He's also a world-renowned expert in Russian architecture and an explorer of the Russian countryside. Great to speak with you again.
You're welcome.